Mark, welcome to the Happy Engineer podcast. Glad you're here, man.
Zach, thanks for having me. I guess I should say I'm happy to be here.
I mean, it would be a bit of a disappointment if we started the Happy Engineer podcast in a bad or sad mood. So I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Mark, it was fun before we hit record today to catch up on a very somewhat random point of connection in our history around your body of work and expertise in lean, which every engineer I've ever coached in some capacity, whether it's through Agile on the software side or true lean manufacturing or lean PD, is exposed to the importance of lean principles in engineering. And I was thinking back to my old days in the lean experience training through the Lean Learning Center with Jamie Flinchbaugh, where we built these Connects airplanes. And it was build your manufacturing system and working through the lean principles to build these things. I forget how fast it was, but it was really hard. It was one of the most engaging trainings I've ever done. And I mentioned to you this unexpected and unintentional consequence of lean training that I'd love for you to riff on with me, because we learn all these skills and tools to improve production systems or product development systems or our own workflows. But we end up sometimes walking away with this belief system or fear of failures, that we need to design out every possible failure and that failure is bad and don't make mistakes. Don't make mistakes. Make it perfect, right? Flawless execution. That's maybe not how it was intended. And I was wondering if you could just start there and tell us a little bit about your lean background and where we pick up these mindsets in our engineering careers.
That's a great question. It's a multi-layered question. There's a lot going on there. Like, first off, for one, shout out to Jamie. I've known Jamie for more than 20 years now. He was a year ahead of me at the same engineering and MBA program.
Oh, no way.
At MIT.
So cool.
And we have become really good friends, and we do a podcast together occasionally called Lean Whiskey, where we talk a lot about lean, a little bit about whiskey, and Jamie's great. But to your question, I mean, I think as with many things, like, it's a matter of finding a balance. Like, I think back to the training and the experience I've had working with former Toyota people. Like, it always comes back to like this word balance. Yes, you're right. We want to design out mistakes proactively. We want to create systems that are full of mistake proofing, robust systems. That's important. Like, our engineering training and brains are really attuned to that. At the same time, it's really hard to expect that we would do a perfect job of designing out and preventing mistakes. It's just not likely, especially in complex changing systems. If there are simple situations where simple mechanical or electromechanical mistake proofing can be designed and works perfectly. But with all of that intent of trying to mistake proof things, there's still that question of then how will we respond, or how will our manager or how will our organization respond when a mistake still happens?
Yeah.
And hopefully that response is not punitive, but instead kind and constructive, so that we can learn from the mistake. Because if we're punished for those mistakes, we're going to protect ourselves and learn to hide the mistakes when we can, or drive them underground. And then the organization can't learn and benefit from those mistakes. So there's this balance of not being flippant and not saying like, it doesn't matter, we'll learn from our mistakes, we'll iterate, it's fine. There are certain mistakes that would be really bad, and we want to do everything we can to prevent. But then at the same time, realizing, okay, when mistakes do happen, let's make sure we can use them to our future benefit.
Yeah. The culture aspect of how we respond to mistakes, I know we're going to dig deeper in and relates to the topic of your new book. But the word balance, the word that popped into my mind right after that, and I want your perspective, was the word binary. And I feel like so often we see each failure as either good or bad. We've either succeeded or failed. And we tend to take this black or white binary view of balance. Which side of the scale did I land on? Can you address that? And would you say there's times when binary is good or true, or is this a continuum? How do you look at it?
Yeah, the real world's messy, right? It's the gray area. It's the numbers in between 0 and 1. And that's where, I mean, for all of the strengths and benefits that come from an engineering education, one of the things to try to work past is the idea that we can calculate the answer in a known and definitive way. What's expected of us in a lot of engineering courses? Calculate the answer. And in the real world, again, it's messy. We may have a solid hypothesis that we can go and test. We might have a concept or a design that's agreed upon as being 85% correct. And now let's go pilot the change. Let's test the idea, then iterate on top of a good idea. So back to the word balance again, there's a balance between not being irresponsible and just throwing stuff against the wall, quote unquote. But at the same time, if we in certain situations are spending so much time trying to have the perfect solution before we move forward, we'll get stuck in analysis paralysis.
Yeah.
And not be willing to move forward. So again, like a lot of it is situational. Like testing a rocket and knowing that there's a chance that it might explode, there's a reason to not test those rockets with humans on board, right? There's also a time and a place to learn from past practice and learn from the mistakes others have made before, to not have too many rockets exploding maybe unnecessarily.
This relationship that we have to failure or mistakes, and I do want to get curious on maybe the distinction between those two words for you.
There's a difference, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe we start there really quick. What is the distinguishing factor between a failure and a mistake?
Yeah, I think they're related, but they're not synonyms, right? So to me, a mistake, it's an action or a decision that turns out to be wrong in some way or not wholly correct. There's not binary right, wrong, good, bad, success, fail.
Yeah.
But the mistake is the decision. A failure to me is an outcome, right? So a mistake could lead to a failure. And I don't mean that, again, to be 0-1 binary black and white thinking. Some failures are the result of factors other than mistakes, right? We could do everything right and still fail. Failure, I mean, that's a tough word, because I think there's a lot of gray in Toyota thinking. We think of what was the gap between expected outcome and actual outcome.
Yes.
That's all gray area, right? So if we fall a little bit short of our expectation, is that a failure? Well, no, I'd say, okay, well, there's a gap. And then we can identify that gap. And hopefully we're in a psychologically safe environment where we can learn from the gap instead of having to defend ourselves of why we didn't get the perfect performance that we might have predicted or hoped for.
I love this. I've never heard the words intentionally separated this way. Maybe the dictionary's always been this way, Mark. I've just never noticed. But failure being an outcome, and how we define the targets and what failure means, notwithstanding. The mistake being the decision or the input side. So input versus output. And I love that distinction. And then what happens to me, and I know for my clients who I coach, we tend to then smash these two things together, and the fear of failure makes us afraid to make a mistake. The perceived failures that may come creates this culture around mistakes, to your point earlier on the people side. And so where did you first become sensitive to the culture around this in engineering and in companies? Something's broken here.
Yeah, I can't point to a moment. I think some of it was, there's many influences there. I think some of this was just gradual recognition. I did want you prompted a thought though that I'm
go ahead.
Share. When you talk about fear of failure, I don't know if it's fear of failure. It's the outcome beyond the failure. It might be fear of punishment. In some cases, punishing ourselves, or fear of being punished by our organization. I think that's the thing that people really fear more than the quote unquote failure. Because if we're in a culture where we are allowed to view or encouraged to view or supported in viewing, I love this phrase, a failure being a stepping stone to success. I think it's healthy to view that our gap that way as a stepping stone. Let's learn from it. Let's not deny the role that our decisions made in that failure, because then we're just going to be repeating them. Silicon Valley phrase I like to poke at sometimes. I know this is veering from the question. We'll get back to your question.
That's right.
Sorry, but fail early, fail often. I'm like, no. I would say fail early, succeed later. There's people in Silicon Valley who I think are correct in bringing up this idea that, okay, we need to embrace failure, quote unquote, fail forward. I'm like, okay, I like that phrase, fail forward towards success. But I appreciate the people who point out the idea, like, let's not make it a failure fetish. Yes. We don't love failure any more than we love mistakes, but we can frame it in something that's more positive so that we can use it as a way to move forward. So, I think I've had influences even going back to the beginning of my career in General Motors, thinking of like two different plant managers that I worked under. One that was definitely a culture of fear, a culture of punishment, even if it wasn't your fault, even if it wasn't your mistake. Yes. Versus a second plant manager who had the benefit of Toyota training, looking more at systems and supporting people instead of just judging and blaming them. And then a lot of it, unfortunately, is sort of on the negative side in healthcare, where I've done a lot of my work since 2005. Unless proven otherwise, the expectation is the culture is one of naming, blaming, and shaming. What happens when someone goes wrong? Naming, blaming, and shaming. I'm like, that's so counterproductive over time. If you were really looking to reduce mistakes and reduce harm to patients, punishing each mistake that happens is just not the pathway to get there.
Yeah.
If you think simplistically, well, mistakes are bad, and if I punish mistakes, people will learn not to make them. I'm like, that's just not how the world works, really. I think there's a lot of inspiration or drive that comes from trying to help healthcare shift that culture. Now, to be fair, there are some leaders and some organizations that are moving in a much more positive direction, but the punitive norm in healthcare reminds me more of General Motors 1995 than it would remind me of Toyota of any year of the last 25. Good math for an engineer. No, don't edit that out. It's my mistake. It's okay. I'm not that old.
Mark's giving away some insider information here. Well, I love what you just shared. I'll echo a sentiment that I coach with our clients at Oasis of Courage when we talk about fear and the relationship we have to fear. Fear of failure, I often say, is more closely related to a fear of judgment. And sure. To your point, it's like the punishment. It's how will the company react? What will my boss say? Will I lose my job? It's not about failing the test or the failure itself. It's this idea of, hey, if no one else were around, if nobody else would ever find out, most engineers actually look forward to the opportunity to test and fail, to let things break and learn. It's like we enjoy breaking stuff, but not when other people see that and then blame, shame, complain, or the things you mentioned. So I want to talk about your book then and link this, because the new book title, The Mistakes That Make Us, Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation. And just the idea that there are such big swings in this culture between industries, between companies, between individual leaders, and maybe even within ourselves in certain contexts. Here I respond this way, here I respond that way. So what's the sort of central thesis that you've discovered around the mistakes that make us?
I think there's two levels. One is sort of on an individual level, and then there's one on an organization level. One is the reminder we all make mistakes. We're all human. So what matters is an ability to learn from them. There's two pieces of how do we react to our own mistakes. Like I'm happy when I'm doing new things. I get unhappy at myself for making a mistake. I'm like, oh, that was sloppy. When I step back and say, well, are there certain things that habits or certain things that I do of like, am I rushing through my work unnecessarily? That will increase the risk of error. So I can try to be a little bit more mindful of recognizing, okay, hey, you're rushing, slow down, right? And that doesn't mean I'm going to be perfect, but I might catch, or I might reduce some of the opportunity for mistakes. And then I think in a workplace, there's this need to create, psychological safety. And leaders can't mandate that. Leaders can't say, hey, this is a safe environment. You should feel safe speaking up. Like, well, that can only be proven true maybe over time, right? Leaders
Wait,
can encourage
hold
it.
on. You're saying you can't just declare a zone psychologically safe and it becomes that, Mark?
I mean, you can try, but I would say it doesn't work because, so there's a question of do people believe you? So what I've been fortunate to learn now from the realm of psychological safety is the idea that leaders can lead by example, by sharing their own mistakes and what they learned and how they've adjusted. That leaders can admit moments when they were wrong, or instead of being all knowing and saying, hey, I have an idea, I know it's going to work, let's implement it. Like, well, okay, that might work. Or maybe more realistically, you've got a really solid hypothesis about something that will be effective. Let's go test that change, like a little bit of humility of distinguishing between when we know versus when we need to go test. And when we can do those things, people are more likely then to feel safe. They can decide to feel safe sharing mistakes or doubts or the need to go test something. That culture of reducing the risk, I think, is more effective than telling people you should be brave or that you should feel safe. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's one of the core themes. And, I think a lot of this came out of, when I started interviewing people on the My Favorite Mistake podcast, I didn't know it was really all going in this direction. But hearing people's stories, it's so easy to want to go on a podcast and share all the great things you've done. But when I think, really successful people are willing to come and share, here's a mistake, but better yet, here's what I learned from it. Here's how it maybe benefited me in some way. That's a good example for others. And again, on that individual level, we say, well, if they've made mistakes, they've either succeeded in spite of the mistakes or sometimes through the mistakes if they've learned. And then, as I was kind of processing and thinking through and looking for patterns and stories from companies like Toyota on one level, software company Kinexus at a younger company, smaller scale, like what are the stories that help illustrate the organizational culture where it's safe to speak up about mistakes, because instead of being punished in a reactive way, it's viewed as an opportunity for learning and growth and the prevention of future mistakes. This book concept evolved a lot over a year, from a kind of simple idea of like, I'm going to package a bunch of my guest stories, to realizing I think there are a couple core themes now to build around and use those stories to support that theme and thesis instead of being the book.
So we'll put a link to the My Favorite Mistake podcast in the show notes for sure. And I know every engineering leader that I've ever coached will want to tune in because it's a topic near to our hearts. How did we take, there we go. For those on the YouTube channel can see the actual, I love that. So if you're on the audio only, you missed a beautiful mug with Mark's mug on it. So tell me, is there a story for you that really stands out as embodying the right kind of culture, either because it was so wrong that it highlighted what's right, or it was right, either from the podcast or your own life? Mark, what's the one that really stands out to you?
I know you said the one, but I'm going to share, there's a couple stories that make clear there's a pretty consistent culture across Toyota. And again, I'm not trying to say black or white, good or bad, that they're perfect and other companies aren't. But there's two stories in the podcast and in the book. One from Japan in the late 1960s, Sao Yoshino. And then the other was the late 1980s, Georgetown, Kentucky, David Meyer. And both of their stories are similar. One was a paint department. One was a bumper part molding department. But, there was a production defect. And in both cases, like the root of the problem was basically either putting the wrong chemical into the paint machine, putting the wrong chemical into the molding machine. And in both cases, there was this consistent, not coincidental, but consistent organizational response that didn't blame, quote unquote, the person who made the mistake, because they're working in a system. There's a lot of people working in that system. Why was the wrong chemical even there to be loaded into the machine? The response was very consistent of reminding, quote unquote, the person involved, it wasn't your mistake. It was an organizational failing. If anything, we let you down. We're sorry.
Oof.
Let's learn, let's look at the root cause and figure out how to prevent that from happening again. Those stories are powerful. And there's other stories I've heard from other settings, other Toyota people that I wasn't necessarily able to put into the book. Now, do they react that way 100% of the time? I would say probably not, because the company is not perfect. People aren't perfect. There's the values and what we want the culture to be. And sometimes there are gaps where people fall short for different reasons. But I think those stories are just really powerful to think of. Again, different decades, different countries, different settings, really powerful example that I think we can really learn from and try to apply to other industries, other companies, other settings.
I tell my clients all the time, bad systems beat good people every time. I don't know if maybe Peter Drucker gets credit for that. I'm sure every lean
I've
coach
heard
Deming, yeah, but like
Deming gets credited with that, I think. Yeah.
they've all said it. All the greats have said it.
It's
But
good thinking. It's just good thinking. Yeah.
I love that comment you made as a leader, for you to take a posture of the system has failed you as an actor in that system. And we're not going to blame individual actors. We're going to assign blame to the system and work together on the same side of the table to go address that. And Mark, what I'd love to hear from you, and having coached so many people through this and having now written the book and compiled these stories, your perspective, like, it's easy for you and me to sit here and talk about this. And I get it consciously. It makes sense. And I agree with it. And I want to apply it. But then when I make the mistake in my own business, and when I was an engineering leader and I made the mistake myself there at Whirlpool Corporation, especially when it then impacted my team in a negative way, or there was that fear of repercussion from senior leadership or whatever. Oh, like the emotion of that, the pain of that, the reality that you experience on the ground is a whole lot different than you and I just chatting about, yeah, create a great culture around mistakes. So how do you actually improve at this and work through the emotion and the fear and the frustration or the whatever to move the needle and improve the culture, dealing with ourselves and all of that that comes up? How do we get better?
There's all kinds of emotion, everything you said. There's embarrassment, there's disappointment in ourselves or in others. And I mean, I think we can't discount or eliminate the emotion. We're human, right? As engineers, we're going to tend to the very logical part of our brain, but we've got emotions too, whether we're willing to express them or embrace them or not. And one thing that's important, and I think this is either I try to direct this toward myself or direct it towards others, is kindness. And it's sometimes easier to be kind toward others than it is to yourself. Yes. I'm hard on myself. I'm trying to get better about that. But when I think of times when, like, there's a story in the book from some work I was involved in, KaiNexus, the overly simplistic, incorrect way of stating it would be this person made a mistake and ended one of our webinars prematurely. There's more to it than that, right? There were systemic failures and mistakes made, some of which being mine, and failing to anticipate the risk. And like, it would be totally unfair to have gotten upset at that person and to have blamed them in some way, because guess what? They already felt bad enough, right? And in the phone, or it was a Zoom call, it was probably a Zoom call, I'm not the type who's going to just lay into somebody. It was more of like, help us understand what happened. But then I think, I don't know if it was a look I saw on his face, or I became kind of attuned to the emotion of like, this person was really upset. They didn't mean to do it. Well, of course, right? I mean, there was no intent. They weren't sabotaging the webinar. That would be different. That would be addressed differently. It was a mistake. They didn't know the action they took was going to end the webinar. And I realized that we had to take a beat to ask, before jumping into root cause analysis, before asking why did this happen, what could have allowed this to occur, the necessary question was, how are you feeling? How are you doing? And if somebody feels bad, don't say, don't feel bad, we have to move on. Like, sometimes you have to just let that be for a minute and say, like, okay, do you need some time? Or we can come back to this later this afternoon. This is not a life or death must be, that we must troubleshoot it right now, this instant, to give some space. But then I think what helps us, and I think this is true when I reflect on my own mistakes, and sometimes I try to kind of soothe myself, not dwelling on the feeling, the bad feeling, the embarrassment, the disappointment, the shame, whatever. What allows us to move past that is moving forward now into root cause analysis and process improvement or systems improvement or mistake proofing. Then I think we can say we've accomplished something, and that's very unlikely or impossible to happen again. We can feel good about that, especially when like something like a webinar, again, like it's not a life or death medical mistake that could harm or kill a patient.
Yes. I really love this. For one, Mark, I'm just glad that you're the one saying engineers have emotions too, because I say that all the time and people get tired of hearing it from me. But I'm relating it on an extreme case to the grief that comes from the loss of a loved one. And there's that period where you need to have space to grieve, and everybody grieves differently. Some people experience anger, some people deep sadness or depression, or there's all these different ways individuals experience it. But after some space has been given to grieve, there's then an expectation, we got to get back to life. And there's a phrase that relates to this, like, that person who I loved who's now passed on wouldn't want me to sit here and grieve the rest of my life. What they would want for me is to get back and take the lessons of their relationship to me and the love they had for me and move forward and move on. It's kind of like that on a micro scale. When you make that mistake, there's going to be some emotion, some grief. There may be things you need to process. But the mistake, the thing that was lost in this instance, wouldn't want you to not then move on to the root cause work and to improve and grow and get to where you need to go. You don't just sit in the anger for the rest of your career. It's like, let's take it now and do something with it. And I just really admire like that leadership from you to recognize that and give the space, but then also lead the next step and the improvement that needs to happen so that we get both benefits. The individual feels cared for as a human, and the system gets cared for as an engineering leader. Like that is the big win.
Yeah, well, I mean, and where we start having what we describe as culture is like, these accumulated experiences and accumulated interactions. And I'm not the only one leading the way with this at KaiNexus. The co-founders, Greg and Matt, other senior leaders at different levels. There are very consistent stories of the way people react constructively to mistakes. That builds a culture where, we do a weekly all hands Zoom call on Friday. A lot of people, it's a hybrid meeting, but anyway, we're all on there together, whether we're physically present or not. And I can't tell, it's not every single week, but very frequently, somebody on the team will voluntarily share a mistake they made that week, not to shame themselves and not to have abuse piled on them, because that's not what happens. Nobody's laughing at them or, oh, you idiot.
Yes.
Your turn to be an idiot. It's not that at all. But, people are sharing the mistake in the spirit of, hey, this is something you can all learn from my mistake. There was one story of somebody, I think this happened pretty recently. I'm pretty sure it's not in the book, of somebody admitting, hey, I thought I was waiting on a customer to get back to me. And what this person discovered was the email was caught in the outbox. It had never gone out. Their assumption that they were waiting for the customer turned out to be incorrect. And they shared that. And I don't know if they even came up with a solution, but then our CEO, Greg Jacobson, jumped in and said, that's happened to me. Right. So first off, there's like this validation of,
yes,
we're all human. There's some tech involved, right? But it's how we're using the tech. And then he shared something like, well, one thing I do, like he's big on using an app called Todoist. And he said, I have a weekly reminder on Todoist to check the outbox and make sure nothing's gotten stuck.
There you go.
In that unsent mode, right? So there was that validation and coaching, and it's okay, but let's learn from this, right? So it's Karen Ross. So a friend of mine, she's not an engineer. It's good to know, benefit from the perspectives of non-engineers. But Karen's been involved with Lean for a long time. And Karen coached me a lot and made the book better by helping me understand the difference between nice and kind. She's written a book called The Kind Leader. I would recommend to people. Nice might be a reaction of like, well, not wanting to point out the mistake. Like Zach made a mistake, but I don't want to point it out because it might make him feel bad. But then you, Zach, might be then doomed to repeat the mistake because you don't know. Nice might be focused on not wanting to make anyone feel bad, where kind might be a little challenging or a little uncomfortable, but kindness is helpful.
Yeah.
Right. So if I share a mistake with the intent of helping you learn and prevent it, I would argue that's really kind. And I think Greg's response was kind. Yeah. Like, it's not just this whole, oh, it's okay, don't feel bad. It was the response to the reaction that takes it a step further of saying, hey, these things happen, but here's what I've learned. Let's all learn from that and maybe all adopt that practice. And, maybe once a week reminder is not enough.
Yeah, I think
it needs to be a daily before you go home. If you have a checklist of how you wrap up your day, look at the outbox. That takes 2 seconds, right? But if you build in that habit or have it on a daily to-do list or a daily checklist, you can still improve upon the improvement.
Yeah, back to the system there. So Mark, if someone wants to take a first step towards creating and cultivating a culture of learning and innovation through how we approach mistakes, what is the most important thing to get right out of the gate? What would you give someone as a way to begin?
There's always this question of, does a leader, if you're being a leader, work on yourself before you try to help others? So I'll share maybe, I think, 2 first steps, depending on the situation. One, I think a practice, at least that's been helpful for me, is intentionally calling out mistakes I've made. Again, not for the purposes of shaming myself or dwelling on it or whatever, but to call it out, to acknowledge it. And it could be as simple as, just you're interacting with somebody or you're like, oh, yeah, you're right, my mistake. That meeting's not on the 16th, it's on the 23rd. Okay, then you move on, right? Don't make a big deal about it, but just kind of calling out, like, that was my mistake, I made a mistake. That was like calling it out. I think over time, maybe it takes some of the edge off. And to be aware of, like, how many mistakes we make all day long, but we might still be successful anyway. Like, none of these little mistakes are killing us. So just acknowledge them, try to learn from them when we can. I think just that habit of calling it out. But then now I think when a leader does that, this comes back to building psychological safety, modeling what they call this vulnerable act. Admitting a mistake creates risk of some sort of punishment or harm or loss. But when a leader's doing that and setting that example, others then might follow the example of admitting a mistake and sharing what they did, or admitting mistake and asking for help, right? And I think that's the powerful thing at Toyota, is that mistakes or problems or someone pulling the andon cord is supposed to generate a helpful response.
Yes.
And I think that's true at KaiNexus and other companies that have been working to cultivate this sort of culture. And it was a gift of mine, actually. My friend Don, who did the cover design for me, the artist who did that, I've known him a long time, was trying to figure out the subtitle. And at first I was using a word creating. I'm like, well, creating sounds a little too much like a project. Like, oh, we created the culture and now well, no, it's really, he suggested the word cultivating. I don't have a garden, but you think of like cultivating a garden, it's an ongoing process if you want the garden to keep growing and to not just survive, but thrive. I think the same is true with the culture. It's not a one-time effort of a leader making a pronouncement or saying, okay, well, it's now safe to share your mistakes, or we now declare this a culture of continuous improvement. You must speak up with your ideas. I'm like, well, no, if there's been a pattern in a history of fear and punishment, we have to now demonstrate in very active ways that we're changing. Really, we can't say it's changed. We're only, I think, changing and try to bring our team or our organization along with us.
It takes it all the way back to the very first comment around balance, and it's continuing that. But yes, every culture initiative is an ongoing one. The repetition of those experiences, absolutely crucial. Well, Mark, I want to give the whole roadmap to everyone today, but we don't have time for that. So where can people get a copy of the book and really plug in with your work if they're inspired by this and know the importance and the value of cultivating a culture of learning and innovation? Give us that information. Where can we find everything
Yeah,
we want.
I'm going to hold up. Here's the cover design for the folks on YouTube. It is available. I mean, most books these days are bought through Amazon, so it's available at Amazon in paperback, hardcover, and Kindle versions. It'll probably be also available through other retailers. The book and publishing supply chain works a little bit more slowly, but the quickest and easiest way. It'll definitely be first available through Amazon. People can also learn more and order the book at mistakesbook.com. They can find links to different places they can buy the book if they wanted to buy a signed copy, or if they like the book and want to do a bulk order for their team or their organization. Awesome. I can certainly make that happen. It's some win-win pricing. And again, mistakesbook.com. I managed to snag a pretty simple.
Yeah, I was going to say, huge win on the URL side there. Domains are hard to come by. So we'll make sure all those links are in the show notes for the happy engineers out there. And definitely, a book club or a way to plug in with your organization, get everybody a copy of this is a great idea. So definitely reach out to Mark if you have any questions about that. And Mark, I mentioned before we recorded that I would love to be involved in supporting the book. And so happy engineer listening, if you want a signed copy of Mark's new book, The Mistakes That Make Us, I will be sending 3 of those to the first 3 people who email me directly with that book title in the subject line. And of course, I need your address to be able to send you that copy. Mark has kindly offered to create 3 of those signed copies of his book. We'll get that to you, to the first 3 people who hear this, and email zach@oasisofcourage.com. So shoot me a note with The Mistakes That Make Us in the subject line and your address where you want that signed copy shipped. So Mark, thank you for your generosity in making that happen. And
thank you.
Let's end where I always do. I'm excited to hear your thoughts, Mark. Great coaching, the work you do, great engineering, which you're not a stranger to, has in common. The lean training taught us this as well, so you'll appreciate that questions lead and answers follow. Mm-hmm. And if we want better answers in our life, we need to ask better questions.
Yes.
So if someone is inspired by this and wants to experience a better culture around mistakes, if they want to advance in their career, have more of the good life, what would be the question that you would lead the happy engineer with today?
I'm going to share a question. It comes from the Toyota stories of the question that gets asked after a mistake, even a mistake that leads to a multi-million-dollar bad result. The question, and I think it's a helpful question, what did we learn today? And it's a really powerful question.
I love the simplicity of that. What did we learn today? Whether it's a minor glitch or a multi-million-dollar mistake or result, the outcome, the failure. Yeah. What did we learn today? Mark, I learned a ton today. Thank you so much for your generosity. I can't wait to get a copy of the book myself. I got the first chapter from you, but I can't wait to see the whole thing and go cover to cover. And just want to acknowledge the work that you've done, the millions of lives that you're touching. I know on LinkedIn, unbelievable audience and following, and your work is tremendous. So highly encourage every happy engineer, get a copy of the book, plug in with Mark, and shoot me that email. If it's the first week of this podcast dropping, make sure you reach out if you want that signed copy. And Mark, thanks again for being here today. This has been awesome.